I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Does he even know this footage exists? Today isn't about a clip that went viral. It's about the silence that followed. Because when 50 Cent helped bring this documentary to Netflix, people expected shock. What they didn't expect was restraint. Moments where the camera lingers, then cuts away. Sentences that stop just before they finish. Names that appear once, then disappear completely. That's not accidental storytelling. That's controlled storytelling. From the very first minutes, this project feels different. Not louder, not messier, quieter. And silence in this industry usually means power is in the room. You can feel it in the pacing. You can hear it in what isn't said. There are scenes that feel edited down too carefully. Stories that sound like summaries instead of explanations. And reactions from people who look like they know more than they're allowed to say. This isn't a documentary trying to expose everything. It's a documentary showing you exactly how much can't be shown. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because when a producer like 50 Cent, someone known for saying exactly what he thinks, chooses implication over confrontation, it raises a bigger question. What requires restraint from someone who usually doesn't have any? Halfway through, you start realizing something else. The real tension isn't in the footage Netflix approved. It's in the gaps between scenes. The pauses, the quick transitions away from certain topics, the way some conversations suddenly end. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because this story is moving fast, and the details people are missing right now are the ones that matter most. What you're watching isn't just a story about one man or one moment. It's about how narratives are shaped when multiple interests collide. Legal limits, corporate decisions, reputations that affect more than one career. And when you understand that, the documentary stops feeling incomplete and starts feeling intentional. Because sometimes the most revealing thing isn't what's exposed. It's what everyone agrees not to touch. And that's where this really begins. Once that realization settles in, the documentary starts changing shape in your mind. Because now you're not watching for what's being shown, you're watching for what's being avoided. There's a moment early on where a source begins explaining how certain rooms worked, how invitations weren't random, how presence itself meant something. And just as the explanation starts getting specific, the scene cuts. No follow-up, no clarification, just a transition to the next topic, as if nothing was missing. But something was missing, and that pattern keeps repeating. Every time a conversation edges toward names that still carry power, the camera shifts. Every time timelines start overlapping in uncomfortable ways, the edit tightens. You're left with fragments instead of conclusions. That's not how exposés usually work. That's how negotiations look, because a true tell-all burns bridges. This one walks carefully across them. The people speaking aren't denying anything outright. They're choosing words like environment, culture, unspoken rules. Language designed to say something without triggering consequences. And you can see it on their faces. The hesitation before answering. The glance off camera. The relief when a question changes. What's striking is how much of the story depends on context instead of accusation. Who was in the room? Who stayed quiet afterward? Who benefited from things never being put on record? That's where the weight is. Because when you strip away the headlines, this stops being about scandal and starts being about systems. How influence protects itself. How stories get buried not by force, but by agreement. The documentary doesn't accuse everyone. It doesn't need to. It shows you the structure and trusts you to connect the dots. And that's more dangerous than naming names. Because once you see the pattern, you start recognizing it everywhere. In old interviews that suddenly feel rehearsed, in friendships that lasted longer than they should have, in silence that stretched on for years without explanation. This isn't a story that ends with one reveal. It's a story that quietly rewrites everything you thought you understood before. And the more you sit with it, the clearer it becomes. What Netflix released isn't the full truth. It's the version of the truth that was allowed to exist. By this point, the documentary isn't trying to shock you anymore. It's trying to train you how to listen. Because once you understand the rules of this world, the quiet moments become louder than any accusation. There's a stretch where former insiders talk about access. Not fame, not money, access. Who got invited back? Who stopped getting calls? Who suddenly disappeared from certain rooms without explanation? Nothing criminal is said out loud. Nothing has to be. You start noticing how careers moved in waves, how someone would rise fast, stall suddenly, then reappear years later under a different banner. How alliances shifted right after certain nights, certain tours, certain private gatherings that were never photographed publicly. The film never says those moments caused anything. It just places them next to each other and lets the silence do the work. And that's where the tension comes from. Because power doesn't usually announce itself with threats. It operates through opportunity, through favors that feel optional until they're not, through doors that open once and never again if you ask the wrong question. Several voices describe the same feeling using different words: pressure without instructions, expectation without contracts, loyalty without explanation. That's when you realize this isn't about one person being exposed. It's about how an entire ecosystem learned to protect itself by never putting anything in writing. Even the editing reflects that. Footage lingers just long enough to make you uncomfortable, then pulls away. Old clips resurface, but only the parts that were once ignored. Smiles that now look rehearsed, jokes that land differently when you know who was listening, and slowly your role as the viewer changes. You're no longer asking, what did they do? You're asking, why did nobody ever push back? Because the most unsettling part isn't the rumors, it's how normalized everything felt at the time. People didn't act scared. They acted careful. And careful behavior doesn't come from nothing. It comes from experience. What the documentary does next is slow everything down. It stops chasing names and starts tracing behavior. You hear about moments where nothing bad technically happened, yet everyone in the room remembers the tension. Conversations that suddenly changed direction. Phones that stopped ringing after a certain night. Invitations that quietly disappeared. No one says they were threatened. They say something worse. They say they understood when to laugh, understood when to stay quiet, understood when asking one more question would cost more than it was worth. And that's when the picture becomes clearer. Because real power doesn't need to scare people. It just needs to make consequences predictable. The documentary lays out how reputation worked like currency, how being good didn't mean being honest, it meant being useful, how staying neutral wasn't safety, it was alignment. You start seeing how silence wasn't random, it was rewarded. People who kept things vague stayed close. People who pushed for clarity drifted away, not publicly, professionally. And that distinction matters, because when careers don't end in scandal but in slow erosion, no one calls it punishment. They call it timing, bad luck, industry politics. But when the same pattern repeats across decades, luck stops being a convincing explanation. There's a moment where archive footage is replayed without commentary, no narration, no accusations, just a long pause on a face that knows the camera is there and still chooses not to explain. That pause feels heavier than any allegation, because explanation was possible. It just wasn't chosen. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. Every past interview feels different. Every carefully worded answer sounds rehearsed. Every no comment suddenly feels like a strategy, not restraint. The documentary doesn't ask you to believe a theory. It asks you to recognize a pattern. And patterns don't need proof to feel real. They need repetition. By now, you're no longer waiting for a reveal. You're watching behavior. Who stays calm? Who avoids specifics? Who lets time do the talking? Because time in this world has always been the safest place to hide a story that was never meant to be finished. By this point, the story stops feeling like an investigation and starts feeling like a mirror. Because the documentary isn't telling you what to think anymore. It's showing you how things were allowed to feel normal for far too long. There's a shift here that's easy to miss if you're only listening for names or accusations. The focus moves away from what was captured and toward what was never challenged. People describe being in rooms where nothing was said, yet everything was understood, where laughter covered discomfort, where the music stayed loud enough to drown out questions, where nobody needed instructions because the rules were already known. And that's the part that lingers, because rules don't exist unless they're enforced, and enforcement doesn't always look like threats. Sometimes it looks like access. Access to rooms, access to opportunities, access to people who can make things happen or quietly make them stop. The documentary lets you sit with that idea longer than expected. Long enough to realize how many careers were built on proximity, not talent. How many friendships survived because boundaries were never tested? How many people learned that staying close meant staying quiet? What makes this section unsettling is how ordinary it all sounds. No chaos, no shouting, just routines. Routines where certain nights blurred together, where the same faces appeared again and again, where conversations reset the next morning as if nothing needed explaining. And when someone did try to step back, they weren't confronted. They weren't attacked. They were replaced. Replacement is cleaner than conflict. It leaves no record, no villain, just absence. The documentary uses that absence as evidence of something deeper, not wrongdoing, but design. A system that didn't need force because it had momentum. A structure that didn't need lies because it had time. Time to let memories fade. Time to let people doubt themselves. Time to let uncomfortable moments turn into inside jokes or forgotten stories. You start realizing how silence was never a gap. It was a buffer. A buffer that protected reputations. A buffer that protected relationships. A buffer that kept everything technically intact while emotionally unresolved. That's why this part hits differently. It doesn't accuse anyone of a single act. It questions an entire atmosphere. An atmosphere where clarity was optional, where explanations were postponed indefinitely, where the safest move was to let things pass without naming them. And once you see that atmosphere clearly, it changes how you hear everything that came before. Every pause sounds intentional. Every smile feels measured. Every "we'll talk later" starts to feel permanent. Because later never came. And when later never comes often enough, it stops being coincidence. It becomes culture. That's the realization settling in here. Not that something shocking happened, but that too many things were allowed to never fully end. And stories that never end don't disappear. They wait. By now, something important has shifted in how this story feels. It's no longer about what was shown on screen. It's about what can't be unseen once you recognize the pattern. The documentary slows everything down here on purpose, not to dramatize, but to let the weight of repetition settle in. The same environments, the same social circles, the same faces orbiting power without ever fully explaining why they were there or how long they stayed. When moments repeat often enough, they stop feeling random. They start feeling curated. What stands out is how carefully everything was spaced apart. One moment here, another years later. Nothing close enough to force a conversation. Nothing tight enough to demand accountability. Distance becomes the strategy. Time does the cleaning. And by the time anyone thinks to ask a question, the moment has already aged out of relevance. That's when silence stops looking passive. Silence becomes coordination without communication. People describe being present but not participating, seeing but not reacting, knowing just enough to understand the rules, but never enough to feel responsible for breaking them. And the rules were simple. Don't ask too much, don't stay too long, don't be the first to speak. Because the first person to speak changes the temperature of the room. The documentary doesn't claim everyone understood everything. It suggests something more realistic and more uncomfortable. That most people understood just enough to protect themselves. And self-protection is powerful. It turns curiosity into caution. It turns discomfort into professionalism. It turns memory into something negotiable. What makes this section unsettling is how calm it feels. There's no chaos here, no confrontation, just maintenance. Relationships maintained, access maintained, distance maintained. That kind of order doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when people learn over time what behavior keeps doors open. And when doors stay open long enough, people stop questioning why. That's where the real tension sits now. Not in any single reveal, but in the realization that the system didn't rely on secrecy. It relied on familiarity, familiar faces, familiar settings, familiar excuses, enough normalcy to keep everything moving without interruption. You start to notice how often conversations ended right before clarity, how often explanations were implied instead of stated, how often someone else was expected to ask the hard question and never did. That expectation is the shield, because when everyone assumes someone else is responsible, no one is. This part of the story doesn't accuse anyone of intent. It exposes habit. Habit is harder to defend against because it doesn't require planning. It only requires repetition. And repetition is everywhere here. Same patterns, same pauses, same silences at the same pressure points. Once you see that, the story doesn't feel explosive. It feels engineered to endure. And endurance is far more dangerous than shock, because shock fades. Patterns don't. That's why this moment matters, because the audience stops waiting for proof and starts recognizing structure. And once structure is visible, the story no longer depends on new information. It depends on whether the silence continues. At this stage, the documentary quietly flips the pressure. Instead of asking the audience to judge what happened, it asked them to notice what never happened. There were moments when explanations could have closed the story, moments when clarity would have ended speculation, moments when a simple answer would have been enough. But those moments passed, not with resistance, with avoidance. And avoidance is revealing, because avoiding a question isn't the same as not having an answer. It's choosing not to give one. The film revisits interviews that once felt harmless. At the time, they sounded smooth, confident, controlled. Now placed back to back, something feels off, not wrong, incomplete. Answers that circle but never land. Sentences that stop just short of meaning anything concrete. That restraint used to look like professionalism, now it looks like strategy. You start to see how power behaves when it knows it doesn't have to explain itself, how it relies on reputation to do the talking, how it trusts time to soften edges and turn discomfort into nostalgia. What's unsettling is how effective that trust was. People moved on, headlines changed, careers continued, and because nothing blew up, silence was rewarded. The documentary lets this realization sit. No music cue, no dramatic turn, just a quiet accumulation of moments where something could have been addressed and wasn't. That's when the story stops being about individuals and starts being about insulation. Insulation from consequence, insulation from scrutiny, insulation built by layers of familiarity, loyalty, and unspoken rules. You hear how being close to power meant learning when to disappear, when to stay off camera, when to let someone else take the spotlight, when to accept that certain conversations were off limits without ever being declared that way. Those boundaries weren't written down. They were felt. And felt boundaries are the hardest to challenge, because challenging them makes you look unreasonable, like you're breaking etiquette instead of asking a fair question. That's the trap. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of enforcing silence. It shows how silence enforced itself. Because once enough people benefit from not asking, the system sustains itself. No threats required, no orders given, just a shared understanding of how things work. And that understanding becomes generational. New people enter the room and sense it immediately. They don't need to be told. They watch. They adjust. By now, the viewer realizes something important. The story didn't survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was normalized. Normalized silence, normalized deflection, normalized moving on without closure. That's what makes this section heavy. Not the idea that something dramatic was concealed, but that too many people learned how to live comfortably inside unanswered questions. And once unanswered questions become comfortable, they stop demanding resolution until someone lines them up, until someone refuses to let time separate them, until patterns replace excuses. That's where this is heading, and you can feel it, because the silence that once protected everything is starting to feel loud. This is where everything shifts, not because something new is revealed, but because something old finally connects. Up to this point, the documentary has been teaching you how to watch, how to listen for gaps instead of statements, how to notice what keeps repeating without ever being acknowledged. And now it places those moments side by side instead of letting time separate them. That's the turning point. Because when distance disappears, excuses lose their power. Suddenly, interviews from different decades feel like the same conversation. Pauses line up. Deflections mirror each other. The same comfort with ambiguity shows up again and again, no matter the era. And you realize this was never about waiting for the right moment to explain. There was never an intention to explain at all. Silence wasn't temporary, it was structural. The documentary doesn't raise its voice here. It doesn't escalate emotionally. It does something far more unsettling. It removes the benefit of maybe. Maybe it was misunderstood. Maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe it was just timing. Those maybes stop working once patterns become visible. Because patterns don't need accusations. They explain themselves. You see how questions were managed instead of answered. How narratives were redirected instead of resolved. How attention was allowed to drift until nothing felt urgent anymore. And the most uncomfortable realization lands quietly. This system didn't survive because nobody noticed. It survived because noticing didn't seem to change anything. People learned that speaking up didn't bring clarity, it brought distance. That asking questions didn't lead to answers, it led to isolation. So silence became practical, not moral, not noble, practical. And practical choices, repeated over time, build cultures. This is the moment where the documentary stops being about exposure and starts being about accountability without accusation. It doesn't say who is guilty. It asks who benefited from never needing to explain. Because explanation creates records. Records create memory. Memory creates responsibility. Silence avoids all three. That's why this moment feels heavy, not dramatic, not explosive, inevitable. The audience is no longer waiting for proof. They're watching how power responds when its patterns are recognized. Because once recognition happens, silence doesn't reset the conversation anymore. It freezes it. Every pause now adds weight. Every non-answer becomes data. Every attempt to move on feels unfinished. And that's the point of no return. From here on, the story doesn't need new material to keep unfolding. It only needs the silence to continue behaving the way it always has. Because now everyone can see what it's doing. And once silence is seen as a choice instead of an absence, it stops protecting anything. It becomes the loudest part of the story. By now, the tension isn't coming from what's being shown. It's coming from what happens next. Because once a pattern is recognized, the story stops belonging to the filmmaker and starts belonging to the audience. People don't need to be told what to think anymore. They're watching behavior, timing, reactions. Who stays visible? Who suddenly disappears? This is the phase where silence changes meaning. Earlier, silence felt like confidence. Now it feels like calculation. Every appearance is examined for what's missing. Every statement is weighed against what it avoids. Every pause becomes part of the record. And the industry feels it, not loudly, but deeply. You can see it in the way conversations shift, the way names are referenced carefully, the way stories are framed without finishing sentences, the way people speak around things instead of through them. That's not coincidence. That's adaptation. Because when attention becomes patient, power has to adjust. It can't rely on time to erase memory anymore. Clips don't disappear. Interviews don't fade. Context doesn't reset. Everything exists at once. And when everything exists at once, coherence matters. This is where pressure shows up without outrage. Not mobs, not viral rage, just expectation. The quiet expectation that if something has followed the same shape for years, maybe it deserves a complete explanation. That expectation doesn't demand a response. It waits for one. And waiting is uncomfortable for systems built on momentum, on moving forward, on letting the next headline replace the last unresolved one. But the audience didn't move on this time. They slowed down. They noticed how often clarity was promised later. How often later never came. How frequently silence appeared at the exact moment resolution would have closed the story. That repetition doesn't scream wrongdoing. It whispers strategy. And once people hear that whisper, they can't unhear it. This is why reactions matter more than revelations now. Because reactions reveal priorities. What's addressed quickly, what's avoided entirely, what's treated as worth explanation, and what's treated as beneath it. Those choices create a hierarchy, and hierarchies tell stories. The documentary doesn't need to push further. It lets the environment respond. It watches how comfort shifts into caution, how confidence tightens into restraint, how silence grows heavier the longer it lasts. Because silence used to be neutral space. Now it's evidence of a decision, not evidence of guilt, evidence of control. And control, once noticed, changes the relationship between power and audience forever. From here, the story doesn't escalate. It stabilizes. It becomes something that lives in memory, not headlines. Something that resurfaces every time a new appearance happens. Every time an old clip is replayed. Every time someone chooses not to answer. And that's the kind of story that doesn't burn out. It waits. By the time a story reaches this point, something important has already shifted. It's no longer about exposure. It's about awareness. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next for the impact to continue. No new footage. No fresh statements. No explosive claims. The framework has already changed. And once that happens, control quietly slips away. Because now the audience isn't waiting to be convinced. They're watching. Watching how silence is used.